Welcome to Radical Acts of Creative Ageing. My name's Farrell Rinalden, Director of CADA, Creative Ageing Development Agency. The dictionary defines the term radical as fundamental, to root out, and we want to explore what this could mean for the future of creative ageing. We are inviting a number of creatives to offer their reflections on what radical creative ageing means to them. So today we speak to Stella Duffy. Welcome.
Good morning.
So Stella is a psychotherapist, currently completing a doctorate in existential psychotherapy. Her research is in the embodied experience of post-menopause. As well as her private psychotherapy practice, Stella has worked in NHS cancer psychological support, hospice bereavement support, and low-cost community services, offering individual and group therapy. Alongside her therapy work, Stella is an award-winning writer of 17 novels, over 70 short stories, and 15 plays, and worked in theatre for over 35 years as an actor, director, facilitator, and improviser. The co-founder, and for 8 years, the co-director of Fun Palaces, working with communities, creativity, and inclusion across the UK. Stella has been active in equalities work in the arts and the LGBTQ communities for many decades. In 2016, she was awarded the OBE for services to the arts. She is also a yoga teacher, leading workshops in yoga for writing, and a regular contributor to events supporting the childlessness community. Welcome, Stella. Wow.
Thank you, Carol.
You are very busy.
I am very busy, but I am also 60 and I've been working since I was 17. So that's 43 years of work. I think it makes sense that you get a list like that.
It certainly does, but it's a very eclectic, perhaps from my perspective, or you maybe see the kind of rounder picture of the journey of where you've come from. But that's actually my first question to you, is what first motivated you to have a creative career, and has this motivation changed over time?
So my background is that I'm the youngest of 7 kids from a council estate in Woolwich in southeast London. My parents met during the war. My dad came over from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to fight fascism. He met my mum. Between them, after the war, they had 7 kids. And when I was 5 years old, we moved back to Aotearoa, New Zealand. My dad hadn't been back for decades. And I grew up in a small town in the middle of the North Island that anyone who's ever visited Aotearoa, New Zealand will have driven through, because it's definitely not a tourist spot, where my parents were economic migrants and both worked in a timber mill. So I have no background in the arts or creativity. I hadn't heard the word agent, for example. I didn't know what it meant. My parents both had to leave school at 14. All of my siblings left school at 15, 16. Because I was the youngest of 7, there was enough money to keep me at school long enough to do the exams, to do the interesting stuff. And it's not that my siblings haven't had great lives. They've done amazing things with their lives, but they didn't have, education is such a privilege. Young women of Afghanistan, right? It's such a privilege. And I know it because I lived it, that privilege. And so by the time I was 15, 16, 17, with what is really, an astonishing thing to be able to go to school and to come home from school and think, what do I want to do? Which I know is, crappy when you're 15, 16, 17 and you're pissed off with it all. But because it was different for me compared to my siblings and my parents, I started to do things like, because our little town was also 3 hours from the closest gallery and theatre, join the local operatic society. Not that they did much, so it was, musicals and the little theatre. And I also had the great privilege, actually, my small town, Tokoroa, had a very high Māori, Samoan, Niuean, Tongan, Polynesian population. And those are oral storytelling cultures. So until white people arrived and said, no, you've got to write everything down, these cultures had these great long stories of who they were and where they were from and how they expressed themselves in song, in dance, in weaving, in carving. And so I grew up around people for whom performativity, not on stage necessarily, but it would be normal to perform your ancestry. It would be normal to share your story in song or in weaving or in carving. And so it was really fortunate. I mean, my town, you know, when I went to university, the first in my family to finish high school, not just to go to university. When I went to university, I was mocked for my very strong small town New Zealand accent, for where I came from, which I actually think had a lot of racism inherent in it. But for me, what it gave me was a deep understanding that creativity is not just something other people do. It's something that all of us are. That everyone has creativity as part of them. My mum worked full-time, loads of kids, but she also made the wedding cakes for other people, right? And I would go to bed at, I don't know, 8 o'clock at night at, you know, the age of 9, and wake up at 7 in the morning to go to school, and there'd be a 3-tier, very 1960s style wedding cake with all the beautiful icing. Because my mum left school at 14, she had to get an apprenticeship, and so she got an apprenticeship as a seamstress. And would make all of our clothes. And obviously when you're a kid, you don't want the hand knitted jumper, you want the shop bought one, but we couldn't afford it. That's creativity too. You know, and it's actually really interesting how those skills, my poor dad was totally crap at DIY, but he did, this is a tiny wee 2-bedroom house, he did build built-in wardrobes for him and my mum in their tiny bedroom, and they were made of plywood, and the doors always stuck, and but he got on with it, because partly because we had no money to buy the thing that, you know, all the stuff is made so cheaply now, and by people who we don't know what their working circumstances are. But anyway, that's a very long-winded way of saying I had the great good fortune, actually, of growing up with people who by necessity had to be creative. And I think a lot of working class people have this. And then the extra good fortune of growing up in a extremely multicultural place that really valued the cultures of the brown people I grew up alongside. And so for me, creativity was all of that. So I went to in 1981, I went to the only university in New Zealand. There was only 5 anyway, but the only university in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where you could also do drama. You couldn't do a drama degree. So I did, my first year was just ordinary. You had to do standard papers. And in the second year, you could choose to do drama in the second year and directing in the third year. And I did that and I loved it. But, you know, I left after 3 years and got my first job with a touring community theatre company. And in retrospect, what I also know is that a couple of friends of mine did a creative writing MA. Because my background knew nothing about how universities work, I promise you, I left without knowing what an MA was, or that this creative writing MA was possible. I didn't know, because all I thought you did was you spent 3 years, you got some pieces of paper that said you'd done it, and you played with the stuff you love. Like friends and I, there wasn't a drama club at our university at the time. We founded it, and for the last 40 years they've done an amazing summer Shakespeare, and we were the people who founded the first one. There was a lot of making creative things out of necessity because it wasn't available to us. And I think that's really valuable, actually. I don't mean we should therefore deny people access to stuff, but the big thing is access as a creator, not just as a consumer. And I think there's been a real problem for maybe, I don't know, maybe the last 40 or 50 years, thinking of the arts in Britain, where the emphasis has been on developing and growing audiences rather than developing and growing creatives. Because frankly, for most people, you have to have had a great deal of privilege to understand that you're allowed to be creative in the first place. And those are my privileges, right? They're not the privileges of wealth, but they're the privileges of education, of growing up in a multicultural culture where the other cultures were valued, not just white cultures, and of not having lots. So we, you know, I mean, it makes me sound a lot older than just 60. We made our own fun.
I don't think it makes, no, I don't think it's got anything to do with age either. I mean, it's I've been thinking about it a lot around this idea of creativity being part of the human condition, and even just thinking about that feels like a radical act to think of it as part of humanity, not an intervention, an activity, something you do, something you watch, but just part of the human condition.
There isn't a culture in the world that doesn't tell stories.
Yeah.
Right, it's campfire stories, or it's tattoo as stories, or it's weaving as stories, it's carving as stories, it's handprints in those, you know, caves in France that are the oldest handprints we know, as story. They're not just there going, I was here. They're there going, oh, look, and here's a bison. You know, they're showing us what's going on. It is human to tell story in whatever way we can and whatever way we choose to. And I think a great deal of difficulty, and one of the things I think that is really interesting about CADA's work is that there are a lot of people getting older now who did not have access to considering themselves creatives in their teens, 20s. And it's not for a moment that I think that we shouldn't be supporting children and young people into creativity. I absolutely do. But there are a lot of people my age and older who were never welcomed into creativity and to culture. And so actually there's this huge and growing aging population who we need to serve better in allowing their expression of their creativity. You know, it's like, this is a thing that I used to say whenever I did a big speech for Fun Palaces to support communities to co-create their own cultural events. I used to say, you know, put up your hand if you think Mozart's a genius. And, you know, 99% of hands go, yes, of course, Mozart's a genius. And then I say, keep your hand up if your father made you a scale model violin when you were 3. Because that's what Mozart had. He had, his father was the best violin teacher in Salzburg and quite possibly in Austria. And he had a scale model violin when he was 3. So until we give that to every 3-year-old, we don't know who's talented or creative. Until we give that access to everyone throughout their life, we don't know who's creative. And that's why we need to continually and re-support people into coming into their creativity. I mean, I see this as a psychotherapist all the time. People who think that they don't know how to make choices about their life because simply making choices is a creative act.
That's so interesting. And I think it's going back to what you're saying about being audiences and consumers, but also producers and creatives in your own right. And I just think you can be both. You can be in need of support through creativity, and you can be a creative who is able to produce and develop innovative ideas, and sort of making the kind of differentiation of those two things as incompatible. It makes no sense. And
absolutely. And yet our cultural sector has put so much effort into audience development. As if keeping them sitting here or walking through the gallery is the best place for them. Rather than on stage, holding the cello, making the painting or the sculpture, as if that's the only arts anyway, as if the only creativity happens in formal circumstances.
And I think when you're talking about working class communities as well, that's such a big thing. I mean, we talk about barriers, but just psychologically, I mean, you're far better placed to talk to that. But I just think where people belong and where people feel comfortable is such a huge thing. And to suggest that if you haven't made it by the time you're 21, that if you haven't made your way into a space by the time you're 21, I mean, plenty of people I know who've not been into a theatre and art gallery museum by the time they're already seen as over the hill in terms of their creative potential. Just don't know what people have got waiting to come out. So
I mean, as somebody who, I don't often, but occasionally teach writing workshops, I always say, you know, remember Mary Wesley? She wrote The Chamomile Lawn. It's a massive book and massively successful and had a TV series and all of that, revered as a classic these days. She was 73 when it was published.
Yeah.
You know, remember Mary Wesley, all right? It's great.
And there's so many examples of that kind of pushback, but it's still seen as quite an individual concept that one person can buck the trend.
Yes, that's right.
Actually, I'd like to think that when I'm her age, I've got the potential to do that too, you know, that it isn't just one person's potential, but actually paving the way for more.
Yeah, but that's absolutely a function of capitalism and racism. It, you know, and unless we are supporting everyone to be creative, to have the education that frees them up to think maybe I could, what we are saying is only these people who have this massive privilege of education and time get to be creative. It's the old lie of, you know, well, the black boy will get out of the ghetto if he's a good enough boxer. So well, what about the others who aren't? Why don't they count?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the people who spark up and shine, and people go, oh well, isn't it amazing? So we don't need to support the rest of, you know, their community. Like, no, you need to support the rest of their community more.
Yeah.
Because if one person from a community that is not normally given access to creativity, that is not normally given access to privilege, that is not normally given access to education, if one person can do that, then there is something amazing going on in that community. Why don't we support that community to create the way they want to, not the way we have deemed, I don't know, the people who decide where the money goes, not the way we have deemed is the correct way.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's really, so I'm going to ask my next question, but I just think in terms of the protected characteristic around age, because when we're talking about people, we're very often talking about other people who are doing something, but in fact, we're all aging. You know, that's the reality. No matter if we're 17, 71, however old we are, we're aging. And so by creating these rules of who's in and who's out, we're creating them for ourselves. So if we don't think everyone deserves an opportunity when they're 71 to write their first novel and be a success, that's us.
Yes.
That's not just everybody else. That is us, as in ourselves. So my next question is, do you consciously challenge your own internalized ageism in your creative practice? And what inspires you to do this? Big question.
So now my creative practice is being a psychotherapist. And yes, I do. I have to. I have to confront my internalized everything, my internalized racism, my internalized homophobia as a queer person, you know, my internalized sexism as a cisgender woman who grew up in this culture, and my internalized ageism. And in my doctoral research, that's about what is it like to be being post-menopausal. Because goodness me, we've been told menopause is going to be so awful, haven't we? I mean, it's all, you know, that there's been this astonishing, no one's ever talked about it before. And actually, there's some really good research to say that's not quite true. It's just that younger women didn't want to listen to older women telling them, this is coming, you might find it difficult. It's a little bit like your best friend gives birth and goes, bloody hell. And you go, no, because you're 5 months pregnant, why would you want to hear? Right? So it's not that it hasn't ever been talked about. And yes, it is great that it's being talked about more, but the negativity around this very normal and physically natural life transition is really problematic. And I think it's problematic because it buys into our ageism. There's a real difficulty around being older in our culture. When I turned 60 earlier this year, because it's not midlife. I'm not going to be 120. And also I had 2 cancers before the age of 50. So I'm going to be, 80 if I'm very, very, very lucky. But people talk about, being menopausal at midlife. I'm like, the average age for menopause in Britain is 51. You're not going to be 102. It's not midlife. It's the beginning of being old. Suck it up. This horror of calling ourselves old is really problematic. And the way people go, oh, well, I'm not old, I'm older. It's like, yeah, and old. Ask a 17-year-old. I took a photo of me. We went to the Highlands. My wife's mother had recently died. And, being a carer for 9 years when you're in your 60s of someone who's in their 90s is bloody hard work. And my wife's And that's happening to a lot of us now, you know, way many more as our aging population ages even more. So we're having to take on a lot more when we're already old anyway. And so my wife's mother died in January, and we got to go away for the first time in ages. And for my 60th birthday, we spent 4 days in the Highlands. And I went, I did go swimming. I threw myself in a loch, screamed, and got out again because it was very cold. It was my birthday's at the beginning of March. But I put a photo of that on Instagram and Twitter, and I said, I'm so excited to be 60 at the beginning of old. And quite a lot of people went, yeah, this is fantastic. Partly, I guess, because they knew my background and they knew about my cancers. And it is a big deal to have survived this long for me.
Mm.
But some people are like, I'm 65. Don't you call me old, young, you know, whippersnapper. And it's like, how can you be 65 and not think it's old? And if you do think it's old and old is a problem, then let's help you look at your ageism. Because this is who you are. This is who I am. It's not, I live through my body, right? This is one of the core things around existential psychotherapy. We live through our body. We cannot live any other way in this world. We are not yet capable of being disembodied brains. Whether your body is, you know, brilliantly functioning or not, and I've lived with chronic pain for decades, and as I said, lots of, you know, a couple of cancers, so it's not always been functioning brilliantly. Whether we live happily in our bodies or not, we can only exist through our bodies. This body is now 60 years old. Globally, that is old. And so if I struggle with that, and I have the number, then it's up to me to do something about how I feel about that. Similarly, you know, as a not mother, somebody who does work in the childlessness community, as we're approaching 25% of women not being mothers, it's not an insubstantial percentage. So we really need to support these people to value themselves as not mothers in the same way our culture values parenthood as if it's the epitome and the highest thing anyone can achieve, while also, hastening to add, telling every parent they're getting it wrong all the time. You know, it's such a up and down thing. All of us have internalized isms of some sort. We can't not. We grow up in an institutionally racist culture, in an ageist culture, in a sexist culture. We take, excuse me, we take that stuff in. When we become it, we then have to confront it in ourselves. So I've had to really look at what I feel my abilities are now, to check where I might need to give myself a bit more time, a bit more rest, because I am older than I was. To begin, I'm really rubbish at this, to begin to be more gentle with my body and push myself less. I mean, I was up wait till 2 o'clock last night, knowing we were doing this in the morning, not because I wanted to be, but because I'm trying to finish my thesis and I've got things whirring around my head, and I'd gone to bed at 12, but I was awake till 2. And I have to acknowledge this slightly difficult dichotomy for me, that I am not a superwoman. It's very hard for me to believe. And I can't do everything, and I can't achieve it all. And that is so huge to my psychotherapeutic work, that what I now perceive my creative practice to be is to support other people to live their lives creatively. And that is, how do we live with what we have, what we in existential psychotherapy would call limit situations, boundary situations. How do we live with what we've got and we can't change? My 60-ness, my chronic pain from having had 2 cancers, from the treatments, and this is what the body I now live with. How do I live with those things as creatively as possible? And by creatively, I don't necessarily mean making product. I mean in a way that fills my spirit. I mean in a way that helps me, transcends a big word, so I'll use it as lightly as possible, but on occasion transcend some of the limitations that I experience as an older woman in an ageist and misogynist culture, as a person who's been very ill several times in a culture that is terrified of illness and death. Terrified. I mean, that's why we're ageist, because age leads to death. Yes, it does. That's right. Age leads to death. Old people die. If we don't look at that, then our time just peters out.
Mm-hmm.
The more we can acknowledge, I'm older, I'm old, that means I'm closer to my death, the better for us, because it gives us such sharpness around our choices.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting because as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about the complexity of that kind of intersectional space, of the kind of shifting from one moment to the next, of trying to kind of analyze. That creative thinking is really interesting, but it's also a radical act of creative aging. It's kind of pushing against this sense of, you know, either having to break all the stereotypes, you know, that you are the one who isn't like everybody else.
So that came up a lot in my postmenopause research. In the, you know, okay, so I'd never heard of a literature review 5 years ago. I didn't know what it was. I've been doing this doctorate for 5 years because I had to do a foundation because I knew nothing of this. So everyone out there who's got an MA is going, how could you possibly not know about a literature review? Yeah, grew up in my family. Anyway, I didn't know what it was. So I then, you know, for my literature review, I've read over a good 200 and 250 papers, full on, hard to read for me, academic papers, although I've trained myself to do it now. And the amount of times this painful dichotomy for women in particular, although I think it probably happens in a version for cisgender men too, of you've got to be a crone or you've got to be a superwoman as you age. That's it. No one's allowed to be in between. No one's allowed to be both.
Yeah.
Right? You've either got to look incredibly young and be incredibly fit and go to Pilates 28 times a day and, you know, care for your grandchildren while writing a thesis, while writing an opera, you know, I don't know, while doing 12 other things. I don't know, probably performing surgery in the morning. Or you've got to be this amazingly wise old person who knows everything. I'm like, fuck off. Seriously. I mean, it's the most painful dichotomy because both of them demand that we're brilliant all the time. That I will be the amazing old wise woman who knows everything is just as damaging as I will be the superwoman. And, you know, for men, there's the cisgender men, there's the same version, right? There's the, you'll be, you know, buff and muscly and all of that for well into your 70s. Or you're going to be this, you know, I've got a beard and I think clever things. It's just bullshit. And let alone people who are trans and non-binary and fit in the gender expansive places we might be, who get to our 70s and go, oh, well, there was never a place for me before and you're still not letting me in, thanks.
And I think it's really interesting what we were talking about before around the sense of productivity, feeling the need to be productive 24 hours a day, that if you somehow skip a day, if you somehow, you know, are happy not being productive, being in a different headspace, seeing that.
Actually, here's a question for you.
Okay.
If you picture a wise old man, is he doing anything physically? What does the picture look like?
Okay, so I'm looking at Lord of the Rings kind of old person at my mind.
So what does he look like?
So I'm thinking about somebody who is thinking a lot, who is breaking a sweat, trying to solve the problems.
Okay, great. Now tell me what you think a wise old woman looks like.
Okay, so this is telling you a lot about me. I'm thinking about Miss Marple and
what's she doing?
She's solving problems. And
is she doing anything physically?
I guess not, unless she's pottering around the village.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, this is what happens, right? And mine are knitting. I'm going to show you this. He's like, I am
The man who knows the things my age has made me wise.
She's like this. Okay. Just had a thought. I fix I'll be knitting while I'm doing this. Because Miss Marple does knit, you know.
She does, she
while
does.
she's thinking, and what knit one per one? It was the butler.
These are the models we still, oh God, it makes me, seriously, it makes me want to cry. These are the models we still have.
Absolutely. And somebody who's in the position that I'm in, trying to challenge my own ageism, push myself to think about radical ways of thinking, but I'm still falling into those stereotypes. Yeah. And it's because we're conditioned to be like that. Yes. If you look, every new movie that comes out, yes. Every story that we hear on the radio just compels into that stereotype. It's really challenging to think about the other, and that other tends to be such a break to the stereotype that they're a one-off. They are not the norm. They are the 91-year-old marathon runner. You know, it's a real challenge. So my question to you, Stella, is what does radical creative aging mean to you?
Well, I think if we are to have the word radical there, I think it really, there's a great writer called Dwight Turner. He's a mental health professional psychotherapist, and he writes brilliantly about being othered. He's a black man in Britain in his 50s, I think, and Dwight talks about the intersection between our privilege and our otherness, and that we need to notice both, so that for those of us with and that everyone has some privilege, right? So and it can be very painful to be constantly othered, but where might you have privilege? Do you have the privilege of being able to walk? Do you have the privilege of being a parent in a pronatal culture? That you might find places where you have privilege alongside your otherness. And that when we can allow that we all have versions of this, and some of us much more of one than the other, absolutely, that within that sort of spectrum of privilege and otherness, there is a place where we might come together and connect in ways that we may not have done before. So for me, the radical part would be around how might we connect differently? How might I connect beyond my, I don't know, traditional groups of people that I grew up with, or that I've known through my work, or that I feel comfortable with. And I think that connection is what creativity is about. I don't see any point in being creative unless it's shared. And it might be sharing it with me, right? It might be me connecting with another part of me. But creativity is for and about connection. So I might want to share it with an audience of 1,000, or I might want to share it with an audience of, can I write a letter to 25-year-old me, to 5-year-old me, to 45-year-old me that brings along some of my past that I want to recapture, and brings back some of the spirit I might have had there that I can use at 65 or 75? Is there a way for me to loop round, because we know time's not linear, to loop round and reincorporate some of the ways I've loved being in the past that I notice I'm not quite being now? How can I bring some of that along with me to help me move forward towards what will be my death? I'm going to say that again. So that's the radical and the creative within aging. We work to connect with ourselves and with others. We acknowledge that connection is creative, and we perhaps stretch ourselves a tiny bit more, not so that we become super person, or, you know, the wizened old crone wizard, whatever, but so that we just get to be a little bit more expansive. My yoga practice, I'm going to do this for you physically again. My yoga practice was a lovely training. And I've practiced yoga for a long time, but one of the things that I always share when I'm teaching yoga for writing is that this part, our heart space, wants to open. You know, and I've had a mastectomy and 2 breast cancers, so actually physically doing this took a lot of practice. You know, for a long time, the most I could do was that, right? It wants to open. And when we open the heart space, we open to other human beings and we open our heart space to ourselves. But the really exciting thing is that on the back, and I don't know if I can, anyway, there's muscles. They look like this. They're called the serratus anterior. I love that I know these things. And I only learnt them at 58. They're there, but they open our wings. And opening our wings is what makes the difference. Opening our wings helps, opening my wings helps me fly, but it also helps lift up others. And not everyone's got arms that move like that, right? I mean, as I said, for a long time I couldn't, but we can emotionally think that. And there's lots of, you know, lovely yogic practices that aren't quite so physical, but we can picture our hearts expanding, and therefore our serratus anterior, our shoulder blade muscles expanding like this for our wings.
It's so beautiful. And it also, I was just thinking back to the first ever anti-ageism training I ever did. I mean, and people, I was thinking, well, you know, but what do we actually do to make positive change? Like, what's the thing that you tell people to do when they go away? And the thing I was told to do was to think about how many friends I have that are not my age.
Oh, yeah.
And to consciously make an effort to make friends who are not my age.
Yeah.
That is an anti-ageism pledge. Thought, wow, it's not as though we're asking people to kind of, you know, do something beyond the realms.
But in saying that, can we acknowledge that not my age doesn't only mean that I need to make friends with 20-somethings. I need to make friends with 80 and 90-somethings.
Absolutely. Or
because
even,
often we perceive it as a backward, can I bring some youth into my life? But actually, can I bring some more age into my life is another lovely way of looking at it.
And since I did that training, the more I've been thinking about bringing in people who are aging differently to me, because you can, you know, when you're on social media, you're tailoring your feed, your kind of content, what you're digesting. And it's very easy in this world to only start to see things through the lens in which you see them, and to very occasionally be challenged, normally, you know, on the news. But actually having people who are aging differently to you as friends, challenging you to think differently, that's really important too, even if people might be the same age, but they are just experiencing their aging in a different way. And that kind of premenopausal, as you were talking about, this sort of fear and loathing and, you know, absolute terror about this.
There are cultures in our world that welcome menopause. I mean, globally, menopause is welcomed enormously because it's a freedom from pregnancy for so many who do not have adequate or safe contraception available. So it's a very, very privileged white Western view to go, menopause is terrible, when actually for the global majority, it's a huge release. But also having friends from not just different ages, but different cultural and ethnic backgrounds as we age is massively important too, because we can learn from other attitudes to aging. You know, and it's the class thing as well. There are other attitudes to aging. It always astonishes me when people go, oh, women didn't used to work. I'm like, my nana was in service from the age of 11. Working class women always worked, actually. There are some groups of women who may not have, but I'm pretty certain that they're the most privileged ones. You know, the more of a mix of the people that we are with, the wider our possibilities. And that's where creativity and radicalness come in, because we get to learn from each other.
Absolutely. So that neatly brings me on to my last question. So if you were to write a radical creative aging manifesto, who would you write it for, and what would your first call to action be?
So because my mother-in-law had such a difficult death, she had a thing where it wasn't strokes, but the small blood vessels in her brain were dying. And she ended up becoming completely immobile and incapable of talking, which was horrendous for her. Very hard for all of us, but particularly hard for my wife, who was her prime carer. I think there is something about, we are failing to look at the mental health of our older people. And I had a lovely placement in my training where it was a creative organization that, you know, they did dance and artwork and creative writing and stuff for old people, 50 plus. Thank you. But, you know, great. And so I had a couple of clients who were in their 70s and 80s. My radical and creative manifesto for aging would be, look at the mental health of our elders. The mental health of our elders, particularly our elders who never thought therapeutic help was right for them. They may have thought it was for different type of people. They may have thought it was for, I don't know, white people, middle-class people, people who could afford it, for God's sake, because it's so bloody expensive. There are low-cost services, and this is where I was working, but we have an aging population for whom mental health and emotional well-being, particularly for people, say, 80, 85 plus, was never talked about as their right. And just as I said earlier about creativity, yes, let's get the primary school kids and the secondary school kids into creativity. Just as we are talking about their emotional and mental health well-being, we have to talk about the mental well-being of our elders. They're not being looked after. They're not being given access to talking therapies. The amount of people I work with whose GPs just went, oh yeah, here, take these antidepressants. And actually, some antidepressants aren't good for, you know, are actually contraindicated if you're over 65. We need to be doing a damn sight more for the mental health of our aging population, not least so that aging population can support itself. So my manifesto would be that mental health and well-being belongs to every age, and that there is an age, our old people, that we are currently neglecting. So get on and do something about it. Both the people who are within that age need to start asking for more support and understanding that they are allowed it. We are allowed it. And the people who provide it need to look where that gap is, because it's everywhere.
And at CADA, our focus is very much on those underrepresented and underserved creative communities. And obviously, with my background, I recognise those groups are in very high need. And it is a challenge to rewrite the narrative around who has permission to be creative, who has permission to engage with that part of their identity and their sense of self, and that part of their human condition, as we were saying at the beginning.
And our emotional and mental well-being is a creative act. It's connected to how full we feel as human beings. And the more engaged we are creatively with our own lives, you know, let alone creating product, the more we are stimulating our mental health, the more we are supporting our mental health. But at the moment, we are ignoring the mental health of a large and growing swathe of our population.
It's true. And I think that's where it's wonderful to end with a call to action for myself, for CADA, for hopefully anybody listening or watching this, that we need to do more and we need to do better collectively if we're going to be able to make a difference. So Stella, I want to say a huge thank you to you for your time this morning. We massively appreciate it. And as I mentioned before, we're not quite sure where this content is going.
It's not exciting, right?
It's really exciting.
Trying a brand new thing with some content that we don't know what it is.
Absolutely. We are being radical ourselves. We're thinking differently about how this content is going to be packaged up, developed, served to people who need to hear it, who just want to be nourished by conversations like this. Because I'm in the sector that I want to support and develop, and I want to hear more of content like this. So yeah, you've got me thinking this morning. I feel fired up. I feel ready for the day. So So thank you hugely for your contribution.
Thank you for asking me. It's really exciting. I'm really excited with what you might do with what we've talked about. And I love the idea of not knowing before we start, because that's like anything, right? I mean, no one gives birth and knows how to look after a newborn. Well, unless you had 5 others. Apparently, according to my mother, as the youngest of 7, it was really easy by the time I came along. But every project is new. Every love affair is new. Every reaching out to a stranger is new. So it's all right that we don't know what this is going to turn into. You'll find out.